Live.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I was looking for a little red box and there isn't a little red box to tell me that we're live, but I believe we are. So welcome, and it's great to see you. It's a lovely day outside, so thank you for spending some time with me this afternoon. My name is Jennifer Carfrae. I'm the programme leader for the Environment and Conservation programmes that are led out of the Central Faculty. And what I wanted to do today is just give you a little bit of an overview about the two different programmes and an idea of the locations that they're delivered from, and some of the content, the modules, the assessments, etc. And so we can pop the slides up if that's okay, Anushka. Okay, and so the first slide here has my contact details on it, just in case you do have any questions following the presentation. So you can see there jennifer.carfrae@sruc.ac.uk. And the first slide itself gives you a little bit of an overview about some of the key aspects that we deliver within these two programmes. And of course, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are very much on political agendas at the moment. And these are very much core to the deliverables within the two programmes in terms of looking at sustainable land management options to try and mitigate for things like climate change moving forwards, and looking at system resilience, etc. I mentioned that we are in the Central Faculty campus. We actually have two campuses within the Central Faculty. So the one on the left-hand side is the King's Building faculty where I'm located. And so this is kind of towards the centre of Edinburgh, but it's actually in a really nice position next to a golf course and the observatory. So it does mean that when you're on campus, we do go outside and we do some localised field trips. And these are happening even at the moment under COVID. We've got a few things happening before Christmas where students can come and meet with us and undertake some of these more practical aspects. The campus on the right hand side is the Oakridge campus, and you can see that the campus itself is much more rural. And this really lends itself to the Wildlife and Conservation Management HNC and HND delivery, where the students are taken out on almost a daily basis into this rural location. And they really get hands-on experience talking to land managers, to rangers, and they do quite a lot of practical applications around that campus itself. On the Edinburgh campus, the benefit for us for the environmental management programme is we're so closely located to industry. So it does mean that when we're talking about things like environmental management systems, renewable energy strategies, for instance, we can actually go out to some of these businesses, organisations and industrial bodies like Nairn's Biscuit Factory, for example, and actually meet with the people that are running these, look at the systems that they've got in place, and students are actually involved in auditing these as well to see whether there's any improvements that can be made in these organisations, and indeed we've asked them to do it in the past for the SRUC buildings as well. So it gives them quite a nice introduction into looking at sustainable development, for instance. So the Central Faculty courses then, we do run the HNC in Wildlife and Conservation Management from Oakridge campus, and the Environmental Management, as I said, from the King's Building campus. That takes 1 year if you're doing it full time, and students can either sign up to do the HNC or they can sign up to do the HND. The HND, again, the Wildlife and Conservation Management, is run from the Oakridge campus, and the Environmental Management from the King's Building campus. And full time, that would take you 2 years. We do have students who sign up to do the Wildlife and Conservation Management degree. Now, if you decide that that's what you want to do, you will spend your first 2 years of the degree programme at the Oakridge campus, and then you will transfer into the Edinburgh campus to complete that. If you're doing the environmental management degree, again, it's a 4-year degree if you're taking it through to honours, and you would be located at the King's Buildings campus for the entirety of that, although we do take you out into the countryside on a regular basis, as and when we can. Obviously, it's COVID pending at the moment. In terms of areas covered by the programme, you can see here and reflect on the differences between the two different programmes, or the two different frameworks, if you like. So for environmental management, we do focus in on things like climate change, sustainability. We look at planning and development and environmental impact assessment, for instance. We do address conservation and ecology, because as an environmental management consultant, for instance, you quite often have to have that kind of background as well, so you have that broader range of background. And we do some more science and biotechnology type aspects within this, so it is much more environmentally science focused. If we look across at the wildlife and conservation management, you can see here it is very directly related to wildlife and biodiversity conservation. We do things looking at tourism and looking at the conflicts perhaps between tourism and managing a piece of land. And we also tie into things like, again, the planning and development aspects. But we cover some slightly different areas like the heritage studies, and the heritage studies is recognising that if you're managing a piece of land and you're conserving that, there's quite often archaeological sites on that site as well that need to be taken into consideration for that in managing both the site, the biodiversity, and of course any sort of tourists that may be coming on to use the site. In terms of the features of both of the courses, we have just come through and literally just finished a revalidation process, and essentially a core part of that is discussion with current and graduated students, really to get a flavour for how they found the course, things that they maybe would have liked to have done a little bit more of, and so really it is both very student-centred, student-focused, and we've very much taken the student voice into account in writing these. We do try and give a variety of different practical aspects of delivery. So you can see here I've mentioned residential field trips. We tend to run them in years 1, 2 and 3. And indeed the third year one you'll see when we come to it is actually now an accredited course. So you actually do that as a module, and we take you away for a week and you do your assessment while you're on location, if you like. We run workshops, we run seminars, we run local visits, and I have to say up till Christmas we're doing a lot of these as a virtual visit, really just because of COVID, but it still gives students the opportunity to see some of the local businesses, to meet with land managers and hear their perspective on what they do and why they're doing it on a piece of land. We also invite in guest speakers, and of course that's still happening. And we then move and progress into some quite project-based work, particularly at degree level. So a lot of our degree modules now have moved away from examination and are maybe assessed based on case study. And of course that's all building up to the final dissertation if you decided to go on to your honours. And for that, your dissertation is a large project that you would conduct either with one of the team or perhaps somebody within research consultancy within SRUC, but we also have had students go externally as well with the external supervisors. So there's a lot of flexibility around that project, and I'll come to that in a wee while as well. The whole course itself has been designed to be as flexible as possible, so we try and support students that are maybe coming in from school and wanting to do an HNC and then decide that they actually do want to progress, so there's a nice progression pathway. We also support students, of course, that are coming in direct to the degree pathway. One of the things we do provide is a part-time possibility, and that you can start right from the beginning, or you could come to us, for instance, in year 3 and say, I've actually managed to get a part-time job with a consultancy. Is there any opportunity for me to go part-time in my studies? And the answer to that is a resolute yes. You have to then obviously talk to the funding body, but the part-time possibility is absolutely there. And we would encourage it if you do obviously get a job in the field to try and get that balance. We do have a flexible learning option as well, or a distance learning if you prefer that term. It is at the moment only available at HNC level, and it is part-time, so that you would conduct that over 2 years to get your HNC. But it is a nice option if you are already working and you're looking to get a flavour for whether the environment programme, for instance, is the programme for you. And also to make that decision on whether you do want to take it further, because as you move into the HNC and the HND and the degree, then you probably do need to commit a little bit more time to it. So you have to reflect on whether you take a sabbatical from work or how you're actually going to fit that in. In terms of the programme aims, we are looking really to try and provide the theory, but also the skills and the practical applications that you would need for the environment or wildlife and conservation industries. So we're trying to raise your awareness, and particularly holistic awareness, so that Rather than becoming quite boxed in your subject area, you've actually got the ability to think about it in broader terms, such as climate change mitigation, or looking at biodiversity, whilst considering some sustainable development projects, for instance, or working with communities. Ideally, we're looking to promote adaptability in the students' approach to environmental management or conservation management, so that you've got flexibility and actually, irrespective of the job, there's a career path that you go into. I think this is now absolutely crucial, and I think COVID's really thrown the light on this, where the need to be flexible, to be adaptable, provides that resilience in an organisation moving forward, and indeed in your own career pathway. And also then to provide students with transferable skills. And of course, this is things like presentation giving, but a large variety of other skills like how to write a blog, how to write a newsletter, how to make a video, for instance. So there's a whole array of different transferable skills that we're giving you, and they do include things like the ability to go and have a job interview, how to write your CV effectively. So quite broad ranging, and they really start to kick in from year one, some of these transferable skills. So industry have quite commonly come back in the industrial liaison I host every year to say that the students are very, very effective in giving presentations, and it's actually one of the strengths of SRUC students, because you come out with a confidence and an ability to do it. Even if you're not particularly comfortable in doing it, you still perform well. I mentioned an articulated progression. That essentially just means that you could join us at the HNC level in the central faculty, and you could progress right the way through to the degree. And indeed beyond that, we do offer some MScs that are related to these programmes. So we have an online wildlife and conservation MSc, and we also have an environmental protection and management MSc. So we have had students, in fact, articulated all the way through the undergraduate, and indeed have continued even on to a PhD with us. So we very much do support students and take them as far as they want to go within their own study pathway. In terms of the entry requirements, if you're coming into the HND, we're really looking for 2 hires, and ideally with 2 Cs. If you're coming in at the BSc level, then we're looking for 2 Bs and 2 Cs. And for both of these, we're ideally looking for something science-based or geography, largely because, as I mentioned earlier, particularly for environmental management, we do have that environmental science focus. And so if you've got some social science background or biology background, for instance, it just means that you're more comfortable with some of the terms and the phrases that we're using. So we do tend to ask for that. In terms of the programme structure, we have, as I said, a progression route. So in first year, if you were only wanting to complete the HNC and you were absolutely certain you didn't want to progress, then we would ask you to complete 11 units. Now, one of these is a 2-credit unit, and that essentially means then that you would gain your HNC, but if you wanted to progress onto the HND, you would have to do an infill year to make up the additional credits to allow you to transfer. So what we tend to do is, even in your first year, even if you're leaving with an HNC, is ask you to do the full 14 modules. And that way, if you decided to move on to HND, you could do it directly without an infill year. And if you decide to leave with your HNC, it's of course a benefit because you have your HNC, but you have a couple of additional modules over and above that. So it actually looks really good for your CV. In year 2, it's quite a similar structure in that you've got the 14 modules or the 14 units that you need to complete to allow you to gain the HND or to progress on to the degree level. And then in your third year, we now have 8 modules. So you can see that the number of modules is declining. You can imagine that that's partly a reflection of the fact that you're moving up in terms of the depth of content and the expectation on assessment, provision, etc. And so at this level, you've got 6 core modules and 2 electives, and I'll show you some examples of these as we move forward. And then in fourth year, you've got 5 modules, and this then includes 3 electives, plus your honours project. And your honours project is the equivalent, if you like, to 3 modules. So it's really reflecting the amount of work that goes into that research project and the time it takes to write it up. So in terms of the teaching team, we are quite broad ranging. We've got a number of staff within the team, and they're sitting, some of them in different programmes. So for instance, Martin Donnelly on the left hand side, you will meet in your first year as part of business and introduction. But he quite regularly delivers some of the economics and business aspects of the programme. We have other researchers, for instance, feeding in. So we've got Rob McMorran and Alistair Hamilton, both in the bottom row there. Rob McMorran does a lot of work in some of the more ecology-based research, and he's involved in the Rural Policy Centre. So he's involved in converting research into guidance for the Scottish Government, for instance. And Alistair Hamilton is one of our researchers that is quite focused on the use of drone technology and GIS, so he's very much one of our tech whizzes. In the top right hand corner you have Andrew Innes. He's your first year tutor. So if you're coming into first year, he will be one of the first faces that you meet. And he's actually a really nice example of somebody that's come right the way through the system with us. So he undertook the programme himself. He then progressed direct from his honours project into a PhD about 10 months later with SRUC, and he has since then done a lot of teaching qualifications and has joined our teaching team. So he's quite a nice person for you guys to talk to in terms of that progression route and what it felt like to do it and what hints and tips he might have. So he's quite good. He's as a first year tutor, very enthusiastic and very energetic. So hopefully you will get quite a lot from him, and you will be meeting him when you join us actually within the first week. So within induction week, all of our year tutors would meet with new candidates and new students and returning students to have a conversation about how their summer has been, but also about their elective choices moving forward, and has their career plans changed, and that kind of discussion, just to get a feel for where they currently are and start guiding them towards where they need to be. This gives you a really nice example of the first year timetable. So you can see that we try and split the modules evenly across the 3 terms. And you'll also notice there that planning and development is sitting in term 2 and term 3. So that is the one that's actually a 2-credit module. So it does span the 2 terms. It means that we can go into a little bit more detail and really build you up from that kind of foundation level, even at the HNC level, through to that practical application, and what does planning look like in terms of policy, introduce you to environmental impact assessment and how you would conduct that and what the relevance is to planning. So it's quite a detailed module. We also cover things, this is the environmental management at Edinburgh, so you can see environmental awareness is in there, ecology and ecosystems. We've got a little bit of geology and geomorphology and starting thinking about geological conservation. And we've got classification and ID of organisms, so you can actually see that the wildlife and conservation management style of module is still within the environmental management programme at this level, largely because if you leave us at an HNC, we want you to have that broad spectrum and the ability to go into an organisation and say that you can effectively go out and ID an organism and conduct an ecological survey. But you can also see we're starting to introduce you to things like pollution and waste management, to transport and thinking about sustainable transport. So much more along that environmental management side, and it really gives that complement then of the 2 aspects, if you like. And from there, if you're progressing, it also gives you a really good flavour of the subject material and the different topic areas and what you would prefer. So I've actually had a student come to me this year who was absolutely adamant that they were wanting to do wildlife and conservation, and that's what they always thought that they wanted to do, and have over the summer had numerous conversations with me and are now moving on to the environmental management programme because they've realised that they're much more interested in renewable energies, climate change, but particularly looking at behaviour change and how behaviour can influence and move us forward to create a more resilient society. So that was really interesting because I think she was almost conflicted because she thought she wanted to work with wildlife and work in conservation, and discovered that actually wasn't her strength, if you like. In terms of methods of assessment, we try and make it as varied as possible. So we've got a range of assessments here running, again, as you can see, as practical as possible. So we do have assessed practicals, we've got assessed essays and reports. We use some online short answer tests, for instance. We do, when we're on campus, run in-class tests, and we ask you to complete posters, infographics, give presentations. We ask fourth years to give a debate. And of course, we do have the more traditional examination in some of the modules as you progress to the degree level. There is an examination in second year as well, in the graded unit. And really that's a culmination of all of the core modules that you've done over the previous 2 years, really to reflect on how well have you absorbed the information and the key points from those modules, but it also acts to give you that experience in examination before you move to degree if that's your choice, or indeed if you move into industry, because quite often as you're doing CPD you'll be asked to do some form of examination at the end of that as well. So again, we're trying to give you as many skills-based assessments as possible. In terms of the residential field trips, the first year field trip is usually run to FSC Millport. Now they're a field skills council run establishment. It would normally run over 4 days, and it is just for environmental students. So you'll be a mix of the wildlife and conservation and environment students. And it means then that we can focus in on some of the ecology skills much more. So you'll actually go out into habitats and run full surveys, and you'll do some of the environmental science if you're on the environmental management programme. So we'll take you out, we'll do water sampling, soil sampling, we'll look at the impacts of pollution, for instance, on the environment. And then for the third year, again, it's a field studies based module, and so an example of where we've gone historically has been the Cairngorms National Park, where we stay at a residential field centre again. This time it's 5 days. Again, it's all environmental students, and you've got opportunity there to do some of the practical aspects, but it also gives you an opportunity to go out and speak to, for instance, the Cairngorm Ranger Service. They do huge amounts of work, and it's quite broad spanning, so you can talk to them about their biodiversity work and how they're protecting and conserving that. But they also do a lot of work in things like flood management and the implementation of urban drainage systems, and basically looking to use nature rather than using some of the older, harder engineering techniques that we've used historically. So both of these are very, very interactive, and it allows you also to do some networking. Again, very, very important when you start thinking about careers, to get a feel for what are other people doing, how did they get there, and of course making that acquaintance and that name so that you can go back to them in the future. So this is an example of one of our first year student groups up at Anachmore. As part of that, they've been looking at the ski run and looking at the impacts of tourism and skiing as an activity. They've also had a look at the renewable energy in the hydro dam. And we take them out onto Peat Bog, which is, I think, one of the highlights, because we get them to bounce up and down and they can actually feel the peat moving underneath them. So it's something slightly different and a bit more fun. When we're up that way, stay at the SRUC wigwam. So this is another example of where we tend to take students. Here we typically would take them up more for an overnight. So we'll go up and do some field trips on the way up the road. We'll stay overnight, and then we'll do some more field trips or case study work on the way back down the road. As you can see, they're a little bit like hobbit huts. Each of them have got a little fireplace in front of them. And so we have an opportunity to do a little bit of socialisation in the evening as well. And you can guarantee that the lecturers that are present will be right in amongst you all and meeting you and obviously getting to know you all a bit better. On these trips then, we can take students out to a variety of different locations to look at different aspects. So in the top right hand corner, we do take students down to Oban to the Sustainable Aquaculture Marine Services, and we go in there and we have a look at sustainable aquaculture, so things like fish farming, how do you do that sustainably, considerations with the fish food, for instance, and there's a lot of research going on, for instance, in the use of sponges and corals to try and mop up some of the excess nutrients underneath fish farms. And then down in the bottom left-hand corner, this is an example of students who have gone out, they've been doing a little bit of field survey, and they're currently there talking to one of the rangers about the benefits of that. So they get a little bit of experience in doing it, and then they talk about why it's important and what kind of changes that kind of survey work can result in. We also then look at, I mentioned skiing as an impact on the environment, and how do you manage that? We also look at things like the activities like horse riding and cycling. Both of these activities can lead to quite significant scarring. And so again, land managers really have to take this into consideration, but they also have to take into consideration how do they stop conflict between groups like this. So if you've got, for instance, an area like Glen Tress where you've got a lot of people going there specifically for biking, but there is a lot of horse riding in that location as well. So a lot of these estates now are beginning to move to quite designated paths and areas for one activity versus another, really to try and keep the groups separated so that the bikes aren't spooking the horses, and the horses are not getting in the way in the bikes, for instance. Again, bottom left hand corner and on the right hand side, the bigger picture, this is Alistair Hamilton, you can see standing in amongst the students. And here he's talking a little bit on the left hand side about the use of GIS, and he's standing up one of the glens just outside Tyndrum. And what they've been doing is tagging some of the cows or the cattle with really just essentially recorders or tags that you can pick up using GIS and aerial survey. So he's using drones, and so what they tend to do then is fly the drones up there. It gives a ping on where the cattle are so they can map the location in the glen, and it gives them an idea about which bits of the glen they're using, is there bits they're not using, and why. And again, on the right hand side, again, this is a drone experiment, but here they're standing again at Tyndrum, but it's the lead mine. And so they're really just using the drone to kind of fly over the site, map the site, look at the quality of the vegetation. So if you use infrared cameras, for instance, you can pick up on whether a plant's healthy or not. So it's another example of where we're using this kind of technology for quite different aspects. But both of them are obviously very, very important when it comes to looking at land management and making change for the future. On the left-hand side, this is, you can't actually see me because I'm too short, but I am in amongst that group. This is a group of students that are in the field at the edge of a landfill site, and so there we're talking about the design of the landfill site, we're talking about the capping system, and we're also, having come away from that trip, talking about actually how sustainable is landfill and the benefits of moving towards things like recycling, for instance. The bottom right hand corner is a very nice example of flooding that's happening, and of course the flood plain that you're seeing there, historically that has been a big issue for farmers, and you can see the sheep in the background, and this is actually one of the fields that is quite a high quality field for grass. Now if that floods, then that's going to have an impact potentially on the health and the quality of the sheep. However, what has happened in the last few years is actually areas like this are being designated as floodplains, so that they're capturing that water and preventing some of the flooding impacts further downstream in urban locations. And so the farmers have had some support to allow them to be able to do this. And so it's one example of the government and policy and funding working with farmers to try and enhance the multi-purpose, if you like, of the land that they've got, but also supporting them in actually delivering what they need to. Again, here you've got examples. So on the left hand side, we're taking them out onto a loch, and they're actually going out to the fish farm to have a look at this. So we take students actively out right into the field and pop them right on top of the fish farm so they can see the processes, they can see the amount of food that the fish get, and they can obviously talk to the people that are running that fish farm. And again, the two pictures here on the right hand side, here we're talking a little bit about land management in the upland area, which is very, very different to managing a piece of land in a state that's in an area surrounding Edinburgh, for instance, where you're in a U-shaped valley. The type of vegetation that you have up there and the potential land uses quite restricted in comparison to the agricultural practices that we would have down here. So we have a bit of a discussion about what kind of activities and land management techniques can be used there. But we also then again talk about things like the right to roam, free access within Scotland, and the impacts that that potentially can have as people are accessing these areas. And increasingly things like wild camping, for instance, and you'll have heard a lot about this over the summer, where people are getting overexcited at being let out the houses again, but leaving behind a lot of the waste and even some of the tents and equipment once they're finished. And of course that then is left, if there isn't a ranger, it's just there for however long it takes for it to degrade. So, you know, there's aspects such as that that are quite difficult to manage as well. And this then is tying into some of the sustainability, because obviously in environment you can focus on the doom and gloom, you can focus on increasing climate temperatures, etc. But we also want to look at, okay, well, what are the things we can be doing and how can we move ourselves away from this and mitigate for it? So on the left-hand side, we've got an example of a constructed wetland. It's got a multiple purpose here. So it's capturing some of the water so that we're reducing that potential for flooding in that localised area. But it's also then capturing a lot of the runoff of things like the pesticides and fertilisers that the farmers may be using on that land. And it can treat that before it's released into the watercourse. So it has a multiple function, and there's more and more push towards these being designed quite aesthetically as well, so that if people are walking around that, for instance, with a dog, that it's actually quite enjoyable for them to do it. So there's some research going on at the moment, both in rural locations like this and in urbanised areas, looking at the different planting types and how we can make this more effective from an aesthetic and acceptability with the local community, essentially. On the right hand side, obviously, this is a very large wind farm. So this is a nice example where the students have gone out, they've been doing an energy and the environment module, and this is one of the visits where we take them out, and they get to see the size and the scale of this. They get to hear a little bit about the amount of energy that one of these would generate versus having a field full of 30 of them. And they do talk about a little bit of the conflict with these in terms of things like the light scatter, or sometimes people can find them quite noisy if they're located quite close to them. And another issue that tends to come up with these is the concerns about migrating birds and things like bird strike. And so again, there's a lot of research going on in this area to find out if that's happening, how bad is it, what kind of impact is it happening. If we're looking at bird strike, is it actually a short-term thing when the new farms are generated, or does it go on a longer-term period? So there's a huge range of different student projects surrounding that. I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about your modules in year one. So again, this just gives you a little bit of a flavour for what we're running across the environmental management versus the wildlife and conservation management. Now, I appreciate these tables are quite a lot to take in. But really what I wanted to kind of draw your attention to is for each of the years we have some core modules which you have to take, but in every year you have an opportunity to select electives around this. And so these electives really are where you start reflecting on where is it that you want to be, what are your interests. And this is one of the conversations that you would have with your year tutor, Andrew Innes. And he would really then be able to kind of sit down with you, talk about where it is that you want to be and which modules would be the best elective choices for you at that stage. And so if I focus on the Edinburgh campus, because that's where I'm located, so I've got a little bit more of an affinity with the environmental management programme. You can see here that there's a range of mandatory modules sitting at the top here, which are the same across both programmes. But you can see that we also then have the planning and development as a mandatory module. We have information technology and data handling as a mandatory module, and this is a brand new one for us, as is the planning and development. So this was one of the outcomes of the revalidation process. We also have pollution management and resource recovery, and economic issues are both mandatory. We then have our elective options, which include classification and ID. So this would be more if you're interested in the more ecological aspects and land management, habitat management. Or you might decide to take something like transport towards a sustainable future, and that is much more gearing you towards the environmental management systems, thinking about renewable energies, thinking about reducing carbon, etc. In year two, the HND and wildlife and conservation management, again, you've got some core modules within here, and we have then an introduction of some of the elective choices here. So things like ecological surveying, for instance. It is a very skills-based module, this one, and so at this stage at the HND, we've tried to give you the theory as much as possible in year 1, and in year 2, we're trying to take that and expand on that and give you some of the skills basis that you're going to need moving forward. Again, there's things like applied interpretation in there for the wildlife and conservation. So it's not necessarily just a case of actually managing the land, but if you've got the public coming on the land, one of the best ways to I think influence is probably the best word. Their interaction with that land and the use of things like pathways is actually giving them an understanding of what's going on there and the importance of it. So using things like signs, poster boards, etc., to give them that information, and this is where the interpretation comes in. So they get a real feel for what's happening and why it's happening, and that tends to influence them to stick to the paths rather than go wandering off across a field full of orchids, for instance. In the environmental management side, we are moving more now towards that more environmental science kind of perspectives. So we have monitoring and analytical methods for environmental science at the bottom there. That module, again, was only introduced a few years ago. It is very, very skills orientated. And so what we tend to do is take students out into the field. We'll talk to them about how do you sample a river system as an example. We'll then get the students to take those samples and they'll either do some analysis on the site using some handheld equipment, or we'll bring samples back to the lab and they'll run them through a grass chromatography, for instance. So much more applied, much more science orientated, but we're also then delivering things like global climate systems in this programme. So we are much more beginning to think about those climate change scenarios. How do we monitor and map those? If we're modelling climate change, what's the benefits of that, and how's that going to facilitate our behaviours and changes and looking towards climate change resilience? So you can see that there's beginning to be a little bit more diversion between the two programmes in terms of the directions that they're going in. In year 3, again, we've got some shared modules here. So for instance, land and habitat restoration as an elective sits across both programmes. We also have multi-purpose woodland management sits across both programmes. But if you look at some of the core modules, you can see that there's a slight shift now in where the focus is lying. So for instance, in the wildlife and conservation, you've got conservation site management, ecological principles, integrated catchment management. So these are 3 core modules that are different to the environmental management stream. Where in the environmental management core module would be climate change. We asked students to do GIS as a core because industry came back to us and said, if you have students moving into any aspect of industry, whether it's consultancy or actually moving into an organisation, the Scottish Government, the Forth Rivers Trust, we've got students moving into, all of these see this as a key skill, so it's one of the ones that we kept and embedded as a core. And we also have resource efficiency and security, and of course when you're talking about environmental management, you're immediately thinking that we want to be reducing pressure on resources. So where is that pressure coming from, and how do we go about trying to reduce those pressures on natural resources? We now have a new module sitting across both programmes, community and project management, and this is a nice one. Again, it's a core for both. We take students out and they actually work with a local organisation in a community project, so you're getting some of the skills in terms of project management essentially, and how do you communicate the needs of that project to the community so that they're actually engaged, involved and 100% supportive of that. And so in terms of actually implementing some of these strategies like urban drainage systems, the more you can get communities involved in that, the more successful they tend to be. So this is a really crucial training and a really crucial skills to be moving forward with, irrespective of the programme. If we then, I'm hitting the wrong button there. Just have a quick reflection on the 3rd year field course. Obviously we get students going out. This one is the one that's accredited. So on the left hand side we've got students out talking about the identification of trees in a winter period, and you can imagine in the summer it's quite easy to go out with a map, if you like, of the different leaf types and be able to identify using leaf and bark. Whereas over winter you're losing that greenery, so you are much more focused on the structure of the tree and the bark itself. So it's a slightly different skill. And they're also there talking about woodland management and the benefits, for instance, of thinning out woodland, but also leaving some of that thinned wood on the floor to support things like the biodiversity and to enhance carbon in the woodland. So again, thinking about woodland management, but thinking about it in terms of what would have happened naturally and how we support things like carbon storage in these soils. You've got students who are going out and they're not looking at the tombstones there, they're actually looking at the lichen on top of it. So they're then mapping out the lichen and they're considering that and reflecting on that in terms of atmospheric quality. So if you go into the Flipgrid pack that's associated with the open days, you'll see that there is a lichen survey within there, and it goes into some of the species that are really heavily impacted by nitrogen being present in the atmosphere. And then there's other ones that really love it. And so if you've got a whole load of these lichens present that are very nitrogen loving, then it tends to suggest that there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere in that location. And that quite largely can be driven by agricultural activity. So it might be applications of slurry or fertiliser if you're in a rural location. Or you could be standing right next to a motorway, in which case it's the nitrogen or the nitrous oxides that's coming out the back of the cars. So this is the students really kind of beginning to get the skills of how do you map these, how do you use mini quadrats to identify how big the lichens are, and obviously doing a bit of species identification. And on the bottom left-hand corner, this is actually a group of students. So these field trips are designed to be very practical, but there's also an element of fun associated with them in that socialisation aspect again. So when we're away for 4 or 5 days, we do take an opportunity to do some fun activities and get to know each other. So, you know, they're kayaking, and of course you've got the discussions around the impacts of things like kayaking on the local habitat there, but actually they're more just doing it because it's something that they fancy doing and it was fun. So so there's an element of that social aspect again. And again, really just out practical orientated, talking to local land managers, experiencing what goes on in the Scottish countryside and looking at the land management. And down in the bottom right hand corner, they're actually there with Eileen Cook, she's actually just retired, who was our economics instructor. So she's talking them to a little bit about things like carbon credits and some of the economic aspects of managing a piece of land. And this leads me then into year 4. And year 4, it is very different in flavour. So you've got only 2 core modules for the environmental management framework, for instance. So we have got novel strategies in carbon management, which is a new module, and we've got environmental economics and sustainable development, and they run alongside your project-based dissertation. So you can do that, as I said, either within SRUC or you might do it in a placement. And then you select 3 electives, and these electives again are very much driven at this stage by your own area of interest and your own career pathway. So you can see here we have opportunity for you to study things like wildlife and resource management conflicts, advanced multipurpose woodland management, and marine ecology. So each of these might be because you actually do want to move into an environmental management stream, but with more of a conservation focus. Or we then discuss things like environmental policy, food and agribusiness management, and we've got waste reduction and recycling as an elective as well. Each of these then are much more about looking at resource use and tying back into things like moving towards net zero carbon. So much more of that kind of sustainability perspective. If we look at the BSc in the wildlife and conservation, you can see here that we've got modules in upland management, for instance, and also looking at things like geodiversity conservation. So we've talked about all the way through the importance of managing habitats, of managing wildlife, even of managing soils, but actually the thing that underpins all of that is the local geology, and if that geology is being continually eroded, then these habitats essentially over time are going to start failing because they're not, the basis of those is being impacted. So again, slightly different flavours, but both of these at 3rd year and 4th year level do run out of the Edinburgh campus. In terms of the honours projects, as you can imagine, because we have such a wide array of different subject areas that we're covering within wildlife conservation and environment, it's essentially the world's your oyster. So we have a range of different dissertation projects that maybe have a social aspect. So there will be a lot of students look at public perception of wildlife reintroductions, so things like the boar, the beaver, etc. There'll be other students that do want to do more technical aspects and something like that. So I had a student a few years ago who was going out and doing a beaver survey using GIS to map actually how active they are away from a water body and what the impacts are at a distance. We have other students who have done social surveys on renewable energies and people's perceptions on things like wind farms and community schemes in particular. So you can see the list here, continued onto the next page, is so varied. We've got things like carbon footprinting in there. We have a lot of students that do sort of waste management, recycling orientated dissertation projects. Or we had a student last year, for instance, who was doing a case study actually on Loch Leven's larder. I don't know if any of you are from up that way, but they were really interested in doing a project introducing vertical rain gardens. And these rain gardens, it's raining right now as I'm looking out the window, are really designed to try and capture that water and again stop it running across the ground into the watercourse and causing flooding and taking a whole load of nasties with it, like heavy metals from the car park, for instance. And so they wanted a student to kind of map out what that might look like, look at the appropriate vegetation types, look at, for instance, the sediment and identify whether a different sediment type needed to be brought in. And so the student wrote up that case study with a specialist, and this was an external specialist this time. And Loch Leven's larder are at the moment planting plants into the ground based on that study. So a lot of these studies can have quite a significant impact as well. In terms of employment destinations, because it's again such a varied programme, there's a huge range of different destinations. So I would say I have a lot of students that end up moving into the Scottish Government, for instance. So I now have 2 in the Marine Department. I've got one that's leading the GIS department. We have a number of students that go into local authorities and the councils to do with kind of waste management strategy. We have other students that have gone into consultancy, and that again is so varied. We've got students that are working through in Linlithgow, for instance, in community projects to do with recycling and renewable energies, and I've got another group of students that have gone into more of an ecological consultancy where they're doing bat and badger surveys and stuff like that. So again, hugely varied. And it really does come down to the student themselves and their own area of passion and that discussion with your tutors as you kind of progress through. And in terms of progressing into the career, we have a group of students this year going off onto a Kickstarter career support for conservation students. And this is a 3-month project that we're running, which is very much looking at developing the student's career plan. So where is it you want to go? How do you think you need to get there? What skills do you have? And really kind of building up that picture for yourself in terms of a profile so that you can then think about, what do I need to put into an application? How do I sell myself, which is always really difficult. And looking at things like CV building and mock interview skills, etc. So there is some guidance and support there to support students in doing that, because that in itself is a big step. We have a couple of videos up. So the 2 videos I've given you here are actually based on the programmes just before they went through revalidation, but essentially the content is almost identical. We've essentially just updated it. It's much more contemporary. We've got much more focus across both programmes on the use of technologies than we did in the previous. But it does give you a flavour for ourselves. So you'll hear from me again in the top one and from Kath Seeds, who's the coordinating programme unit leader for the wildlife and conservation. But I guess probably more key is you're going to hear from some of the students that have taken the programme, and they're talking a little bit about what they've enjoyed and the different things that they've taken away from it. So if you've not had a chance to look at those, it's definitely worth having a look. And I'm just going to pass over now to Gemma, and if you want to pop up, I think there's a chat section. If you want to pop up any questions, Gemma will read them out to me and I can hopefully respond.
Perfect, thank you so much for that. So we've got a question here. Now, I know you talked about it in your presentation, but if you could please go over it again. Someone's just asking, what are the residential field trips?
Okay, so the residential field trips in first year, it normally goes to Millport, and Millport is down quite close to the coast, so we do quite a lot of coastal identification of organisms. We'll do some habitat surveys, but we also then go into grasslands and some peatland. It's a bit of a mix, so the courses actually run across both programmes. So it's field skills for wildlife and conservation, and it's field skills for environmental scientists for the environmental management programme. Both groups of students go together. So again, it means that the environmental management group will do a little bit of the ecology side of things, but they will also then go off and they will do some water management surveying. They'll do quite a lot of soil management surveys. So looking at, for instance, contaminated land, what kind of metals are there, does the application of organic matter improve the quality of the soil, or it might be looking at a local catchment area where they haven't got a buffer strip to the correct distance in certain locations, so you can map that in the water course. And do some water analysis to see if there is a difference in the quality of water closer to where there's the potential for pollution. So they are very, very practical. And so the first year is in Millport. The second year tends to go down south, so they go into Dumfries. And that's much more focused on, for the environmental management group, the economics and environmental sustainability, and we quite often tie that in attendance to a conference or a workshop down in that location that runs at the same time. And so it's much more about having a conversation around some of these bigger issues in terms of the economic incentives for people to do things, or the implementation of credit carbon credit schemes, etc., and whether businesses are interested, and if they're not, why not. So it's much more that kind of discursive, looking at barriers, for instance. And then at the third year level, again, very, very practically orientated, and this is the one that is actually accredited, so tend to take students away for a little bit longer. There tends to be much more of a mix at this stage of doing some of these practical applications, but also talking to the landowners. So you might go out and do a site survey in the morning, and then the landowner will come out and talk to you in the afternoon about the survey work that they've been doing. So why is what you've just done in the morning important? What does it actually show? What management strategies can you then derive from that information? Practical application into what happens next, essentially. It is accredited, so it does mean then that for that you do your 5-day field trip, and at the end you would give a presentation, and that presentation would be assessed, and then within 2 weeks of coming back you're asked to do a reflective log of what you've done actually during that 5-day period. So you'll talk a little bit about your results, but you'll also talk about maybe things that have taken you by surprise and why that is, or you might reflect on something that somebody said that you maybe aren't quite in agreement with, and of course you're going to give a statement as to why that is and support it with the literature. The fourth year we do have, it's not essentially a field trip that everybody would go on, but if you take the marine module, that one does go away in a residential field trip. So again, it's an accredited module, and that's the one where we take students across to Oban to SAMS to look at things like the fish farming, talk about sustainable aquaculture. They actually go into one of the fish abattoirs as well, so at 2 o'clock in the morning they're taken in to see some of these fish being processed. And actually it sounds quite gruesome, but the students every single time I've come back absolutely fascinated at the number of fish that they can turn over so quickly. So again, very, very practical orientated, and the assessment itself is based on those site visits.
Perfect, thank you so much. Just staying on the topic of field trips, someone's wondering, are the costs of the field trips included in course fees?
Okay, so for the first year, not, and so what we try and do is, obviously we make people aware of that before they come onto programme. For that one, it's not accredited. We try and keep the cost to below £250. and we have a payment scheme, so we would ask you for a deposit for that. For instance, in your induction week, we don't run it until the Easter break, so you've then got a number of months to pay up in deposits if you like. For the accredited third year course, the cost of that, because it's accredited, it's part of a module, and the same for the fourth year one, there isn't any cost associated with that, or if there is, it's to do with the purchase of your own beverages, for instance, and if you decide to go and buy presents for family and things like that. So we do try, where there is a cost, to keep them as minimal as possible, and we are always looking at, if there is a cost, how does that reflect on actually what you're being delivered within that package.
Perfect, thank you so much. And the final thing on field trips here, do distance learning students get equivalent practical experience, and do they go on residential trips?
Okay, so the distance learning, what they tend to do is there isn't residential field trips, so there isn't a field trip away, if you like, for a week, but what they do is they run it in 10-week blocks. And so within block 1, you would ordinarily go up to the Aberdeen campus for this one. You would spend the weekend at the Aberdeen campus, so students appear on the Friday night, we do a bit of a barbecue. On the Saturday you would do all of the practical applications, so you would get an introduction to the modules, and then you would be taken out into the field. So for instance, I used to run the distance learning ecology, so I would have students for about an hour on the Saturday morning where I would kind of give them an introduction to that module, what the assessment is, and then I would take them out to Balmedy Beach and we would do a sand dune survey and look at changes in the plant population in relation to the sand itself, and the changes in nutrient status and pH and stuff within the sand dunes. So your practical application kind of comes in these pockets at the beginning and the end of that 10-week block. But having said that, actually the assessment for things like ecology is based on you going out and finding your own habitat, so something close to home for you. So for instance, you might be asked to go out and do an assessment of the vegetation in a local habitat, whether that's woodland or grassland, and you would write that up as a short mini report. So the skills that you learn within that Saturday, that first day, give you the skills that you're going to need to be able to do that and do it in a local site close to yourself. So there's practical aspects kind of embedded within that. And what I would say is, obviously because of COVID, we're teaching remotely at the moment, up until Christmas largely. So we've only got a few days where we're bringing students in on campus, and it's very controlled for health and safety reasons. But what we are doing is providing a lot of these kind of home-based practical applications that you can be doing. You know, if you're going out for a 30-minute walk, have a look and ID a plant on your way, collect some soil samples, bring them back, and we can play about with things like textural analysis and how does that work, and you can do that in your own home or standing out the front door. So despite COVID, we're trying to keep things as practically orientated as possible, and where we might have done something with you on campus before, we're looking at ways that we can do that, still do that with you. So another example is I would normally take students on a walk up Bog Hall, which is a little valley just outside Edinburgh, and one of the things that we do there is we look at the different habitats. We talk about land use, but we do a soil survey, so we start and look at 3 of the typical Scottish soils, and we talk a little bit about the soil biology, for instance. And of course that in itself is a little bit more difficult at the moment because of COVID, so I've run it as a virtual field trip where you're still getting the same information, but you're given it in small 20-minute doses, if you like, for each of the different locations, and there's a little bit of a questionnaire thing that goes alongside each of the different videos, so that you're still getting that reflection, and you're still meeting me, and you've got opportunity to talk about that with me afterwards in a live session. So really it just gives you a bit of a flavour of the blended learning that we're really kind of delivering at the moment because of COVID. But in actual fact, the variety of what you're getting at the moment, I think we've taken huge steps in actually really, I don't know, genning up the course. I think it's much more interactive. There's a lot of opportunity to engage with the lecturer, to have discussion sessions. There's lots of workshops and tutorials. So I think you will very much enjoy this.
Perfect, thank you so much. The next question is, what is the timetable like for distance learning?
It is slightly different again from on campus because it runs over the 2 years, and so what they tend to do is they run it in 10-week blocks, and from my understanding it's in 3 10-week blocks. I'm afraid I don't know a huge amount of this because I'm not actually the programme leader for this. It's Denise Ronald up in Aberdeen. But they tend to, at the moment, run some of the modules that are a little bit more desk-based while COVID's going on. So things like IT skills, for instance, is about to start now. So they've front-loaded it this year. But the distribution of modules for the HNC, you can imagine if I've got 5 in each term for an on-campus over 1 year, you're actually looking at that then being spread across 3 blocks across 2 years. So you've actually got 6 blocks, which means that if you're doing it distance learning, you're probably only doing 2 or 3 modules at one time within one block.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, what assistance do you give in finding work experiencing and volunteering opportunities?
So in terms of actual work experience embedded within the programme, we don't actually we don't deliver something bespoke and specific to that. But what I would say is we do have a Green Feet Society, and this is a society that's run largely by students for students, but I'm involved quite heavily, as are the staff. And as part of that, we've got a Facebook webpage set up so that it means that if we become aware of anything that's happening that's maybe a conservation internship or a change works internship, any kind of work experience, then we would post that up there. And of course, we're also going to post any actual careers that are coming up, so job positions. And students can engage then also with the year tutors and the lecturers themselves, and we'll be meeting a variety of different people from industry as well, so can go to them directly if they're looking for positions. But what I would say is the best way to get into a work placement is to approach people yourself. So get yourself a CV set up, because what they're looking for is your enthusiasm for that area. So if you can say, this is my CV, this is what I've done before, I'm studying this course, I really want to get some experience in this area, that actually counts for a lot when you're going to these people and looking for placements. We do have a number of organisations that students quite typically would go to, so Changeworks is one of them. The Forth Rivers Trust is another that tends to take a lot of our students on voluntary. And actually for them that's a great experience because they get to do things like training in electrofishing, as an example. The company that I mentioned earlier in Linlithgow, we're building a relationship with them. They do a lot of community projects. And again, it's allowing students to come in and get involved in some of those projects, and we actually have alumni that have started as volunteers with them and have now progressed and are fully paid employees of that organisation. I've had other students who have gone to local ranger services and worked with them particularly over the summer. So Scottish Natural Heritage and your local ranger services tend to employ field assistants and surveyors, etc., from around about April onwards. And so what I would say is, if you're interested in doing that kind of work experience, start looking for the positions and approaching people in around about February, and make sure you get your foot in the door. But yes, if there's any kind of, if you get to a point where you're really struggling or you're not sure of who to approach or how to approach them, then absolutely come to your year tutor or any one of the team, and we'll be able to give you some guidance, some advice, and some contacts if we can in the area that you're interested in.
Thank you. Will students get a chance to meet their class before a course starts?
That's a good question, and actually, so the course itself starts on the 28th of September, so your modules officially start then. Sorry, I'm choking on fresh here. The week before that is your welcome week, and so during that week, to give you an example of what we're doing this year, you would get to meet with myself, and within that sphere, you're also then meeting the other students that are taking the programme as well. You then get to meet in a group with your year tutor. So again, you're meeting each of the students that you're going to be studying with and your year tutor for a 1 hour session. you then have a one-to-one session with your year tutor, and that's very much about sitting down and reflecting on where you are with your studies and where you want to be and what your career thoughts are within that induction week, so that really we're just getting to know you and getting a feel for where you're at. And if that is, I want to do something in the environment but I'm not very sure, that's absolutely fine, because that's the starting point essentially. And then this year we've got 2 virtual field trips that are happening. So one's to do with mining, and it's a virtual field trip looking at a global mining system, but then there's a live discussion session with Andrew Innes, who has done a lot of work on contaminated land. That was his PhD in looking at phytoremediation. So he's going to have a live discussion session again with the full group of students, and that's across all years, so you're not then just meeting people within your own year, you're meeting right across the 4 years. And the second one is on renewable energies, but it's tying the development of renewable energies into similar things that nature has. So the field trip itself is taking students into some really interesting tropical habitats, for instance, to look at some unusual organisms and how they trap energy, and then looking at renewables and how we've actually develop technology to mimic that. So again, there's a little bit of that virtual field tour, and then there's a discussion session afterwards. And again, that's across all 4 years. So even though we're kind of online at the moment, there is opportunity for students to kind of generally just get to know each other and chat. And that culminates on the Friday afternoon, where we're going to have a 1-hour session, and it literally is kind of like a coffee and catch up. So there, every single student from all 4 years can attend, and it will really just be a little bit of guided activities so that people can reflect on specific questions. It might be to do with behaviour change, it might be to do with the Sustainable Development Goals, really kind of things like a quiz, for instance. So that gives you another opportunity within that group to meet everybody else. And then there's the opportunity to do more social aspect, because obviously within the programme we've got that environmental feel to the activities we're doing, but our Students' Union are running other events and activities during the course of that week, where you're not just meeting environment students, you're going to be integrating with students from the other programmes as well. I would say that this is quite an unusual year for us, because we would normally do all of this on campus, and of course with 2-metre distancing rules and restrictions of number of people in the same location, we've not been able to do that. But the hope would be that moving forward, that a lot of these activities would actually be kind of live activities on campus, and so where you're meeting them in a virtual environment this year, you would actually be meeting them face to face in future.
Thank you. How many people are typically on the honours degree environmental management course?
Surprisingly, quite. So if I give you an idea, when I went into my honours year, I think I had 7 in my class, and we last year had 27. So the honours year can be quite large. It is because we have in Edinburgh campus the 1st and 2nd year as environmental management only, but 3rd year we then broaden out and bring in the wildlife and conservation management students to the Edinburgh campus. So we have, if you like, an influx of direct entrants at 3rd year into the Edinburgh campus. So the numbers tend to jump up again. And I would say that our withdrawal rate is exceedingly low. I think once students have made that decision to progress to the degree, they successfully complete the 3rd year, and typically all of the students in 3rd year progress to their 4th year to do their dissertations. So we do tend to have fairly high numbers in our final year. I'm saying that fairly high, but if you compare that to university, I'm not sure that they're as high, and actually the benefit of that is you've got smaller class sizes and you've got more of a one-to-one interaction with supervisors and your lecturers. So in 1st year, for instance, at university, you might be sitting in a room of 250 to 300 students, whereas at the moment, the 1st year coming in for environment is sitting at around about 30 students. So that in itself gives you a reflection on actually the amount of interaction and that relationship you're going to build up with your lecturers and myself, etc.
Thank you. Someone's wondering, will you be using Microsoft Teams to teach the course?
No. So we tend to use things like Teams, for instance, and particularly with the honours students where we're maybe going to have a one-to-one meeting. We use Moodle as our teaching platform, and so within that we have a thing called Big Blue Button. So if you're going into any live sessions, it's likely it's going to be through this, where you've got an opportunity for the presentation to run, but you would actually be able to see my wee face at the bottom. Now, I would say that some lecturers don't like that and take their face off, so they'll maybe do a wee 5-minute of here I am and then they'll disappear. I tend to keep my face up there because I feel like you've got that interaction. But it would happen within that, and it allows us to generate things like breakout rooms. So I might give you a 20-minute presentation, and then I would break you into groups and put you into separate rooms, so that one group might talk about the impacts of plastics on the environment, and the second group might be talking about alternatives to plastics, as an example. And then I bring everybody back in again and we have a broader discussion in the bigger group. So we tend not to use Teams quite so much, much more for kind of one-to-one interaction.
Perfect, thank you. Does SRUC welcome mature students from a non-science background?
Absolutely. So what I would say is the application guidance in terms of requirements is very much reflective of a student that's maybe coming to us from school. If you have been out of school but you've got maybe work experience or interest in the right area, you've maybe been doing community work or whatever, then absolutely we would be looking at that, and mature students are very welcome. I've actually got a number of mature students in the programme at the moment, and they build up a really nice relationship as well. So I've actually got a student that's just graduated as a mature student who's coming back in to speak to one of the students that's progressing into third year as a mature student, really just have a chat with them about what it's like at degree level to be a mature student, and have that kind of discussion, and be part of a slightly different peer group to the overall student group, if you like. So you've got that kind of support system in place, almost like a buddy. So we do have quite broad ranging ages within the group, and what I would say is the mature students are much more focused, and that's part of the reason that we would consider that as a separate type of application, if you like, to somebody coming straight from school.
Perfect, thank you so much. Do you know how the course will be delivered during coronavirus restrictions?
Yeah, so as I kind of have been mentioning, we are running largely at the moment on a remote delivery up until Christmas. The feel of that is obviously slightly different. So to give you an example, for each of my sessions, I would have some self-guided study that students maybe do before the session starts. So I might ask you to watch a video and there might be questions associated with that, or I might ask you to read a paper. I would then bring you into a live session on the day that you've been timetabled. So I would give you some information, almost like mini lectures, if you like. And we would then have live discussion groups and tutorials. So a lot of it's kind of activity based. There's a lot of quizzes being introduced. There's a lot of interactive sessions where we're maybe posing some of the more difficult questions and asking you to consider those, or we might do something like that and ask you to consider it over the week between sessions, but then post something onto a forum so that you can get the discussion going before the next session. So the key thing is there'll be a mix of, if you like, guided activities and study activities that are supplemented or alongside these live sessions where you get to interact with myself and cover some of the key materials and discuss things like the assessment and make sure that you're on track for completing assessment and have a good understanding of what the requirements are.
Perfect, thank you. In the distance learning course, how do the tutors interact with students?
It'll be quite similar, I think, this year for both distance learning and on campus, where there'll be a lot more email interaction. Your tutors and personal, if you like, will be interacting in one-to-one meetings via Teams. So you getting opportunity to chat. They tend in the eve distance learning of these live sessions, because of course if you're distance learning, you are working. And so what they tend to do again is give you some guide study activities, but they'll maybe run an evening session for an hour where they'll cover the topic area in a bit more detail, an opportunity for questions to be asked around the topic area, and to the everybody's working towards the assessment effectively. And within these sort of 10-week blocks, you've got your opportunity to meet these people, learners in person at the beginning and at the end. And so at the moment, because we're having to do it learn, and because of COVID it had to be online, the first session is actually this weekend. And so all of the activities are going to be hosted online. But again, it's very, very interactive. There's going to be a lot of activities that are being undertaken rather than it being a series of lectures. It's much more about coming in and doing some of these practical applications, or getting guidance on how you would do those practical applications. So it's all going to have a fairly similar feel. I think on campus we'll be doing much more one-to-one sessions with your year tutor. There's going to be sessions with myself, for instance, where I'm going to run sort of catch-up cafes, so that every 3 weeks or so I'll send out an invite to everybody just to kind of touch base and see how everybody's doing. Are there any issues? Can I help with anything? And of course, the email flow backwards and forwards, we're anticipating will be our main communicating in between sessions, so that if you've got any questions for module leaders, etc., it will be that mode of communication. In terms of email, you can email us directly using whatever email account you want to use. You'll have an SRUC one, or within Moodle platform itself, attached to each module, there's an opportunity to email the module leader directly there as well. So you might be working on something and think, oh, I really need to ask this question, I'm not sure I've understood it. Then you can just click on the button and the email goes sent straight across. I would say that the team try and respond to emails within 3 days. And if they're on annual leave within those 3 days, you should get notification that they're actually on annual leave. So it'll take them a bit longer, so that you at least know that you've asked the question and they will get back to you.
Perfect, thank you so much. Someone's wondering, is it too late to apply to start a course this year?
I would say not. We're in terms of induction, we're not running the induction until the 21st of September. So I would say that if you're really interested and you want to apply, please go ahead and do so. It should still be applicable and able to apply through UCAS. Oh.
Are you still there, Jen?
Aha! I'm back now. I don't know what happened there. That's a really good example of some of the issues that we're having. So I've gone again.
So the next question is, when do students get their timetables?
Okay, so they have already gone out. I have developed a welcome pack this year so that students have actually had that 2 weeks in advance of even induction week. And within that welcome pack, it gives information on some of the key contacts, like Andrew, and this is your first year tutor, but also some of the support service contacts, for instance. So that if you know that you're coming in and you're going to need some additional support, you can start that ball rolling before you've even come in for induction week. And within that pack, I've also given the timetables for each of the different academic years. So the first year students have now already received that, or the ones that have had unconditional firm offers. And so they are now aware of what modules are running when, which I think was quite important, because there are obviously students that are going to be working around these timetables and trying to fit in the work schedules associated with that.
Perfect, thank you. I think we've just got 2 more questions to go. This is probably quite a quick one to answer. Are there bike racks at Oatridge?
Are there bike racks at Oatridge? Yes. I'm going to say yes. I've never cycled there, so I don't know. There's definitely at King's Buildings and at Oatridge, there's a huge car park. And I think, yes, there is bike racks just outside the front door. There we go.
I think there is as well, to be honest. I'm trying to rack my brains. And the last question is, what type of dissertation could a student do?
Okay, so the dissertations are, as I said earlier, extremely varied. They typically would require a student to collect some data in the field. So that would either be going out and collecting data on vegetation surveys, for instance, or it might be going out and running social surveys, so conducting questionnaires and collecting data that way. It is very, very broad ranging, and what I would say is we tend to have a conversation with year 3 students around about just after Christmas. And really it's to start them thinking about the areas that they're interested in, because that's the starting point in developing the dissertation. And so the students themselves typically would come up with their own questions. We do have 1 or 2 that get involved in a project that's already running at SRUC, but we tend to support students in whatever their area of interest is. So I've had a student come to me in the past who said they were interested in the impacts of the environment within a gaming sphere. And it took us a wee while to think about that one, because none of us are gamers, or not that I'm aware of within the team anyway. But we eventually had them do a survey of people who played computer games and how they felt the environment within these different gaming online visualizations, if you like, impacted their perception of the environment in general. And so that was quite an interesting project, and it developed from really him saying, I'm interested in gaming and the environment, to something where he got a 2-1 at the end of it. He got a really good dissertation. So we do try and cater for pretty much anything and everything.
Perfect. That's all the questions that we've got in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everybody, and thank you again for your time. I see the for me anyway, bright sunshine again outside, so thank you very much. Any more questions, drop an email to the email address, and otherwise enjoy the rest of the day.